Hey guys, Jay here. So you probably have seen a lot of isolation devices. I use them myself, but do these actually work? I personally have been a big believer of isolation devices from these brands like Isoacoustic, Tough Nut Audio, Stack Audio, and so on. Because subjectively, they do work for me. And my favorite being actually subjectively speaking, the Tough Nut Audio cones, which is actually not the most expensive one out of the bunch. But up until now, I had no way of objectively comparing these isolation devices and how well they work versus one another. Or spikes. Is it better than spikes? Yes, spikes that's on literally every speaker, including much more expensive speakers like the gutter acoustic speaker I just reviewed. So yes, I did find a way to objectively measure these, but it's gonna require some explanation on how the measurement was done. Because there's not just a single way to measure vibration, and for audio, there is really no standard because nobody is really testing anything. Or I should be fair in saying that not everyone tested the same way for the application of audio. So what you see here is the Vibration Station 2.0, which was designed in collaboration with Solon from Canada, along with Tough Nut Audio, which is a boutique company that sells racks and platforms. And it's actually the platform that I use on my turntable, which is the GP3 platform. And I can tell you it has been a game changer for my analog setup. But this platform was designed to basically test isolation devices and platforms and, racks like this. So how it works is that there are drivers mounted on the bottom of this platform that goes through DSP to basically cross over these frequencies to essentially have a speaker kind of mounted on the bottom of a platform. So it vibrates. It's a vibration station, just like the name, which is really cool. And then you put something on it and put a microphone, but not just any microphone. It has to be a contact microphone, which means basically it picks up only the sound that is coming from whatever is on it. Touching it, contact. Pretty self-explanatory, contact microphone. So it doesn't pick up anything like, that's airborne, right? So if I talk straight to it, it's not gonna pick up my voice or any of the other frequencies from the speakers itself. Now in full transparency, there is a problem with a test like this. The main problem being that the contact microphone, unlike my earthwork microphone to measure speakers, is not calibrated. So we have to set a baseline. So baseline is this graph right here, basically showing the natural frequency of the vibration station alone that's picked up by the contact microphone. So in theory, as long as we compare all our footers and spikes to this graph, and as long as it measures lower than this, it's doing something to isolate something. And we can even know to what degree at which frequency, which is probably the best test that I can give you and myself to understand why the differences that I'm hearing is there in the first place. And I would really appreciate it if you click the like on this video. It will help out greatly. It was a very tedious process to measure all these footers one by one, making sure all the parameters were the same. It was a tedious process that took all of Friday. So please click that like button. It will help out this channel very much. Thank you. Now the measurements will be separated into the low bass section and mid-range and high frequencies separately, because to see all of that data in one single graph and compare it is pretty daunting and hard to see, because some of these differences are more than 10, 20, 30, 40 dB in difference. So it's really hard to see. So when you see this graph, just remember that the little differences, the little gaps actually mean a lot of differences. So let's start with this one. This is the comparison between my favorite tough cones that I use on my monoacoustic speakers and so on versus the Vibration Station 2.0. And as you can see, well, it's just nuts. Compared to the Vibration Station alone, it is more than 20 dB of difference and more than 40 dB of difference in some of these regions. To give you a general idea, 10 dB is about twice as loud, 20 dB is about 4 times as loud, and 40 dB is 16 times as loud in terms of perceived difference. Now the difference is still drastic, but not as drastic when you just put a butcher block. But still, compared to my favorite cones, is better than nothing, but still far worse. But I feel like this is good news because we use butcher blocks. Butcher blocks are cheap and they work better than just having them on the floor. So the lesson here is a platform is good. But how about if we add spikes now? This graph made me laugh. For the love of God, what is the point of spikes exactly? Can someone tell me why we started using them? And this is kind of interesting because this kind of aligns with my kind of experience, subjective experience of using spikes. I just don't think they are a good thing for sonic quality, let alone isolating things. So we can see here that spikes, not such a good job at isolation. Next was an actual isolation device. This is the ungnoi. I hope I'm saying that right, but I'm probably butchering the name. And these have like ball bearings and so on to isolate. It's a fancy device, and it does cost a pretty penny. It does also have like EMI and RFI, rejection with the carbon fiber, which, I doubt it works the way it does, but we'll test that on a different video. In this video, I want to just concentrate on how well it isolates because these are all isolation devices. And as you can see here, disappointingly, outside of the low bass region at 30 Hz, it is basically as bad as the spikes, and the cones is just straight up a clear winner. Now this was interesting to me because even though it works around that 30 Hz region, this unit, this feeder was so hard to use because you have to have it perfectly leveled or it will start rattling. Because it's using ball bearings, it will start rattling. So I definitely don't recommend people using this for subwoofers. Even if it does work at 30 Hz, you'll probably hear the rattling before it does anything at 30 Hz. So in real life, not so useful in isolating things. Next is the isoacoustic pucks, which is the ones that I use all the time in my room for gear. And so I was very excited to try this one out compared to the cones. Still not as good as the cones, with a little as 3 dB or as big as 20 dB difference in these regions, but damn respectable and much better than the previous options. So kind of glad to see that it actually works, after having used it all these years. I mean, subjectively, I knew there was a benefit, but I did not know that it was actually pretty beneficial compared to the controls and even some of the more expensive options. And it does perform almost as well as the cones, which are my favorite at this time. Next is also from Isoacoustic. This is the RIA feeders for speakers. Now the RIA is better than the cones as little as 1 dB and as big as 10 dB in the low bass region. But the rest of the range is a clear win for the cones, which was really surprising for me because considering the RIAs being one of their, much higher end products, I thought that it would completely destroy the cones. But to my surprise, it did. In the low bass, it did perform better. But when it comes to a little bit on the upper bass, the cones still did a good job of winning out the RIAs. So dollar for dollar, I think the cones are still my favorite. But for subwoofers and like really low bass stuff, you might want to consider the RIAs, like large floor standards or something. Next was the Stack 100, probably the biggest footers that I've ever used. And these things are kind of like maracas, like they shake. They have sand in it or some kind of material in it that, you shake it and it just makes noise. It's like a maraca. I like it. But let's see how it measures. As expected, the chunky Stack 100 takes the win when it comes to the low frequency below 38 Hz. But surprisingly, the cones have a very clear win above 60 Hz with a more than a 20 dB of difference, which again, I found very, very interesting because it kind of matches up with my subjective opinion of the Stack 100. Like it's very good at isolating those low frequencies, and I would definitely recommend it for using under subwoofers. But for speakers, I still preferred cones for whatever reason, subjectively speaking, and maybe this is why. Next was the Stack EQ, which is just the smaller version of the Stack 100 essentially that you shake, and it also has sand and thing in it. I love it. I don't know why I just love that. But let's see how this little guy measures. And whoa, look at this tiny little guy. That's supposed to be a smaller and cheaper version of the Stack 100 is even better. Okay, not as good as the Stack 100 with similar performance as the cones below 38 Hz. But marginally better than the cones above 133 Hz with a major win at 145 Hz. While unfortunately, the cones still have it beat by a landslide from 55 Hz to 133 Hz, with around a 10 dB of difference. So when it comes to isolation devices, I'm personally more worried about the low frequencies, and that's basically because low frequencies, the rumble, right, is what causes vibration to happen. But it's also true that vibration can occur in any frequencies. So I wanted to test if it affects mid-range and high frequencies. But realistically, in real life settings, the bass is probably the most important thing, as that's what impacts the room. And technically speaking, the effects of vibration and how well these footers and isolation devices will work depends on how much you crank up the volume in your room, how much bass is pumping out into your room, as well as how close your gear, your rack, your platforms are to the speakers and your subwoofers. So keep that in mind when you look at these data. And actually, I'll share with you a very short story. I had introduced the cones to some of my friends, and two of them reported something that was very interesting. One was a turntable user that was using the cones under their turntable, and he reported that usually when he cranks up his speakers past a certain volume, it would always skip like a broken record, right? Because of the vibration, kind of like you jumping up and down, it happens. If you never experienced that, it happens all the time. And he told me after he put the footers on, didn't happen. The second person told me that he used it under his CD player, which was interesting. And I don't exactly know the reason why, but he has the CD player right in front of his speakers or subwoofers. I can't remember which one, but he had it right in front. And usually it skips when he reaches a certain volume. On certain tracks, that's bass heavy. And so he went back to those tracks after placing the footers, and he was telling me that ever since he installed the footers, no matter what track he played at what volume, it didn't skip. So it is doing something. Okay, let's check out the mid-range and high frequency and the effects these footers and isolation devices have on those frequencies. So first is the vibration station and its natural response versus the cones. And you can see 30 to 40 dB attenuation on the tough nut cones compared to the vibration station. Pretty substantial difference. Once again, 40 dB is like 16 times quieter. Which is really interesting because if you think about it, that means that it affects the vocals, the instruments, the separation, the things that you hear into the music when you use these footers. And that was my personal experience. It didn't just affect the bass when I use these isolation devices, especially the cones that I use from Tough Nut Audio. I experienced a clear vocal, more controlled bass, even a larger soundstage, or at least perceived larger soundstage, easier depiction of instruments. It just made me listen to the music in a more clean way, if that makes sense. And yeah, this kind of measures up. But let's take a look at the butcher block versus the cones. Much better than the vibration station, but still the tough nut cones beat it around 10 to 30 dB, depending on the region. So if this goes to prove anything, butcher blocks work better than putting anything just on the floor without one. So platforms do work, they do better than nothing. But how about spikes? Once again, spikes are terrible. It is worse than just the butcher block by itself in some of these areas. Which is really disappointing because we get spikes all the time by default with all these speakers and gear sometimes, and they just don't work. In fact, they actually make things worse in some of these regions. Now that's a different story with the ISO puck versus the cones. You can see that the ISO pucks do quite well here, even in comparison to the cones that I love so much. But you can still see that there is about 15 dB difference in some of these areas compared to my favorite isolation device, the cones. Now for the keen eyes out there, you will notice that I have zoomed into the graph and have cut everything off above 4 kilohertz. That's because above 4 kilohertz, there was no difference. It was exactly the same. So it would have been useless data to see, and it would have just made things harder to see. So I decided to cut that off and stretch the graph so you have a better visual. Okay, next, isoacoustic RIA versus the cones. Again, you can see that the RIA is slightly better in some parts, but the cones are beating it by 10 to nearly 20 dB in some of these regions. So big respect to isoacoustic, their isolation devices really do work, and I'm glad to see that because I've been using it all these years. But dollar for dollar, the cones really impressing me here. And it's even more amazing because I actually subjectively prefer these cones and the data is matching up to it. I feel good about that. Next is the Stack Audio 100 versus the cone. This time, there is no difference above 5 kHz. This one measured extremely well. It again on par or slightly better in a lot of these regions, but you can see in these parts, the cones are beating it by 5 to 10 dB, and in these two specific parts, the stack audio does beat the cones by about 10 dB as well. Hard to say exactly which one wins on this one, but I give a slight edge to the cones as it's clearly besting the stack audio 100 in this larger range here. And again, if I'm being very self-aware, maybe I'm giving the edge to the cones because subjectively I prefer them, but I think that's another metric. And also, the stack audio 100 is very chunky and it is more expensive, much more expensive than the tough cones. So there is some things to consider there, but the stack 100, very respectable. Next is the little brother, the stack audio EQ versus the cones. Ironically, it does better in the lower octaves than the bigger brother, but overall, the cones have it beat in the majority of these ranges. So once again, stack audio, very respectable performance here. I think they work great as isolation devices, and the small one, the stack EQ, really impressed me. I thought that one was a real killer. But still, tough cones, I overall prefer it subjectively, and they did measure slightly better, but overall, still very respectable for isoacoustic and stack audio. Can't really say the same for the next one. This is the ungnoi versus the cone. And I think this is worse than the spikes. And considering how much this isolation device cost, I found it very disappointing. Now, I did reach out to ungnoi, or whatever the company that carries this, and asked them what kind of measurements they have, just to give them a benefit of doubt. Maybe the way I'm measuring it is different from how they measured it. And they told me basically that it was done subjectively. And they heard a difference. So that's how the product came to be. And I think this, if I'm being totally honest with you, I think it's a horrible way to bring a product to market. You have to have some type of data, especially when it comes to isolation devices. Yeah, So for me, I'll be continuing to use the tough cones and isoacoustic devices and stack audio that actually do work very well. And especially the tough cone, I think I'm gonna be using that all the time because just for the money, it makes a lot of sense. It's not super expensive, but it works super well and compares to a lot of the more expensive footers even. So I'm very happy with it, and I'll be continuing to use their products. So that's pretty much it from me. If this video was entertaining and helpful, please click that like button and subscribe for more future content just like this. And make sure to check out our merch page in the description below, high quality merch. And just don't take it from me, take it from the customer feedback that we get. Once again, I don't like to do things that's not quality, so please do check out the merch. And I'll see you guys on the next one. Until next time.